Hope is on the horizon. That was the message from another company to reveal encouraging results from its trials for a COVID-19 vaccine. Yesterday, Moderna followed Pfizer in announcing the effectiveness of its vaccine. Last week, we spoke to the Federal Minister of Procurement about plans to roll out a vaccine once one is approved. In the last hour, we heard about the City of Ottawa's newly created COVID-19 task force. It will also be thinking about distribution. Here's how the city's General Manager of Emergency and Protective Services, Anthony DeMonte, described the role of the task force.
We're the boots on the ground. We're going to be ultimately, in essence, putting needles in arms, and so we want to work with our health partners here, led by our public health team. How do we get this organized? And if we have these logistical challenges, for instance, for the Pfizer product, what do we need to do? How do we do that? It won't be distributed in doctor's office, so do we need, 4 or 5 sites? How do we get to vulnerable populations? What about, the homeless? And so those are the challenges we're looking at and trying to find solutions for each of those and be ready.
That was Anthony DeMonte. Well, let's speak now to Raywat Deonandan. He's an associate professor and epidemiologist at the University of Ottawa. Good morning.
Good morning.
What do you think the city ought to be thinking about when it comes to distributing a vaccine once one is approved?
Well, all of the things we've already talked about. But keep in mind, too, we might have many formulations available to us, the Pfizer product, the Moderna product, maybe the AstraZeneca and others, and they might all be entering the system at the same time. Now, most of them require a second shot, and you can't get the second shot from one of the competitor formulations. It has to be the same one you got the first time. So how do you keep track of who got what, especially if you're dealing with a homeless population, indigent population, etc.? So there has to be a good tracking system put into place as well. This is going to be one of the most complicated public health endeavors in the history of our country. And I'm pleased to see that we're doing a lot of forward, advanced thinking about it. That fills me with a lot of confidence. But all the things I mentioned already, the logistics, the prioritization of the population are important. But I hope some time is being given to tracking who gets it, where they are, and what they got.
As far as you know, is there a good tracking system out there, an effective tracking system that we could jump on?
Not as far as I know. I mean, I still have my little yellow vaccination book, for travel medicine. That's pretty bad. So there has to be a better way of doing it without infringing on people's privacy. I think the best way is to probably get your family doctor on board, but a lot of people don't have family doctors, especially if we're dealing with this vulnerable population, the high-risk ones, especially the homeless. How do we track them best? The Americans, their plan is to give everyone a vaccination card where it says the dose you got, when you got it, and what formulation it was. So then you produce it again when you want your second dose. But how do you follow up with people who are perhaps, less equipped to follow up on their own, who don't have contact information and so forth? So it's going to be an imprecise process, and some people are going to fall through the holes, unfortunately.
We heard in the last hour in that interview that the city is not necessarily going to have a say in which vaccine is distributed, so they're having to make plans that might not even come to fruition, such as buying specialized freezers if the Pfizer vaccine is chosen, because that one needs to be stored at -70. How important is it to start purchasing those things now, even if they don't come to fruition, even though a vaccine has not been approved yet?
It's pretty important. Now, Pfizer is also making a portable freezer unit full of dry ice to ship their product around. But there's a caveat. Once you take it out, you can't put it back in, or I think there's like a day or so you have to use it. And you can't, the leftover stuff you can't redistribute. So there's going to be a lot of wastage regardless of what we do here, unfortunately. Pre-purchasing this stuff is important. But again, it's going to be a huge resource allocation, and we may end up not getting that product, and now we have all these deep freeze units we don't need. So I'm glad I'm not the one making that decision. That procurement part of it is possibly the biggest part of the logistics element here. And I'm excited that we have that capacity in this country. I mean, we're relying upon the miracle of biosciences to get us out of this, but it's all supported by the larger miracle of infrastructure and bureaucracy, which I find astounding.
The federal government is acquiring the vaccines. The provincial government will decide who gets the vaccine first. The city is the boots on the ground, as Mr. DeMonte said. Are you worried there are too many cooks in the kitchen?
No, but I am worried that we haven't given a lot thought to jurisdiction. For example, the federal mandate is Indigenous people, military, prisoners, right? And so if we're handing it down to the provinces, where does that federal mandate go? Who takes care of, prisoners and military and Indigenous people? That's unclear to me. Also, the distribution plan right now, I think, is to send vaccine to the provinces based upon a per capita basis, so the most populous provinces get more. But there's an argument to be had that maybe you should send it to where it's most needed. For example, the Atlantic provinces are sitting pretty. Maybe their allocation should go to Manitoba or something like that. That's a political decision that may not be accepted well. But if you see this as a raging forest fire across the country, do you send limited water on an equitable basis across the country, or do you send it to where the fire is burning most brightly? And the same argument can be applied provincially. Do you send it based upon a per capita basis within the province, or to the places that are most on fire? I'm not sure what the right answer is, because there's an element of epidemiology there, but also a political element, because people have to be content with the decision.
Who do you think ought to be prioritized for the vaccine?
I think it should be healthcare workers, number one, because you don't want to have your best players in the game taken off the table, right? And so if they get sick, the whole system falls apart. Number two, probably should be the extreme vulnerable, like the very, very elderly. Number three, first responders, police, firemen, ambulance drivers, people who are going to be exposed to vulnerable people. Number three, or four, I forgot what number I'm down to now, but people who are going to be surrounded by other people, like teachers or transit workers. Right? And interspersed in there, of course, are going to be the demographics that are most affected, like people who cannot work from home, the blue-collar workers, lower sociodemographic people who live in multi-dwelling units, right? They can't be away from other families, for example. They're higher as risk. So those elements have to be sprinkled into the hierarchy that we create. And at the very end are people like me, who who live fairly well and can distance quite well. Mm-hmm. So ultimately, though, everyone needs to get access to it, and we need to get access twice. So we have to do this twice, and that doubles the complication.
What about communities that have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19?
Right. So we can talk about racialized communities, but mostly this falls along the socioeconomic gradient. And I mentioned blue-collar workers are more likely to be affected because they take transit to work and they cannot work from home. And also they're more likely to live in apartment buildings and more crowded tenement kind of spaces. So I think they should be in that mix as well, possibly within the first 4 or 5 rollouts. And maybe even I put young people at the very bottom. But some young people live in crowded settings and are first-line workers, grocery store clerks, baristas. They're at high risk, not necessarily of getting the disease, but possibly of passing it on. So if the vaccine is shown to diminish transmission as well as symptom, then we should consider those individuals as well.
I asked Anthony DeMonte about this, about who gets priority, and he was saying, well, it is the province that will dictate that, and he said there are plenty of ethicists working on this. I mean, it seems like a real minefield in a way. What challenges do you think these ethicists have?
Oh, this is so interesting, isn't it? If you look at the global landscape, is it better for us to take our vaccines and give it to all Canadians, as I think we all want because we are paying for them after all? Or is it better to send them to the places that are on fire around the world, like India and Brazil and Mexico? Now, from a global perspective, it makes more sense strategically to stamp out the fire where it is burning most intensely. But from a political standpoint and a selfish standpoint, it makes more sense to equitably distribute amongst those who paid for the vaccine. And we can take that same logic and apply it locally. So provincially, where does it best go geographically? Does it go to the most crowded places, or do you distribute it equally across the province? I'm not sure. Then there's also, the vaccine hesitancy. A lot of people don't want to be guinea pigs, quote unquote, for an unproven product. So healthcare workers, I think most people agree, are first or second in line. But a lot of healthcare workers don't want to be first or second in line because they're also a little skeptical. Not many. I mean, some are. So the ethics also come into not just distribution, but how much to make this somewhat compulsory. It's unlikely to be mandatory, but it will be highly recommended, and it's possible that your job may depend on proof of vaccination. So that makes it somewhat compulsory, right? So the ethics plays in there as well.
It seems like most of the headlines are really celebrating the news from Moderna, from Pfizer. What about concerns about the vaccines? Do you have any?
Well, there's always going to be some concerns. So far, it looks pretty safe, but we haven't seen the full safety data yet. And the sample size of those who actually, got disease is small, and that's not a large enough sample to get a truly granular look at the adverse events. With this kind of product, when it's rolled out to hundreds of millions of people globally, if not billions globally, regardless of how rare the adverse events are going to be, a large number of people are going to get sick from it. That's just the nature of the law of large numbers. And as a result, it's going to create a backlash amongst people who are already skeptical about vaccines. So the job of people like me who are public health communicators just got really, really hard, because we have to be able to explain the risks and quantify them honestly and transparently, at the same time quelling people's fears. So my concerns are how to communicate the safety profile. I think the safety profile is actually pretty good based on what I've seen. But having said that, we've only been with this disease for less than a year. Who knows what the long-term impact is, and who knows how long immunization, the immunogenic effects actually last. It may last only a few months. We don't know yet. It may require further booster shots. So there's so many unknowns here. However, I see mostly very positive things here, and I'm over the moon in many ways.
Okay, good to talk to you as usual. Thanks very much, Raywat.
Thank you.
That's Raywat Deonandan. He is an associate professor. He's also an epidemiologist at the University of Ottawa.